Now, there's a process that occurs here that differentiates between the head and between the spinal column, and it's called occlusion. So let me talk about what occlusion is. As primary neurulation occurs, eventually the anterior neural pore will close up, and you'll still get the posterior neural pore opened up at this region. So what you're going to get is a restriction. You're not going to be able to get any flow of any fluid through the neural tube. So as the anterior region closes up, guess what happens? Fluid gets pushed into the anterior region, and it starts blowing the head up like a balloon, ultimately causing the different regions that are going to become the different parts of the brain. So when the anterior neural pore closes, then you start getting expansion of the neural tube in the head region. Eventually, there comes a point where in order for the head to expand further, the neural tube actually has to pinch itself right at the boundary between the brain and the spinal column. This is what we call occlusion. So what happens is these cells will actually close off and prevent any further movement of fluid in from the most posterior to the anterior region of the head. What will happen then is you'll start getting expansion of pressure in here through osmosis that will cause various regions of the neural tube in the head to start expanding and moving and creating those, what we see here. So without occlusion, they find that the head doesn't expand as much as it should, and you get slow and delayed development of these regions of the brain. So occlusion is necessary for the further expansion and development of the brain. Eventually, this will actually open back up. It doesn't stay closed forever, but there is a period of time where it does need to close off in order for proper development to occur for the brain. So that's what occlusion is. Now, let's look at the brain. Let's look at how the brain develops. It's just the most fascinating organ, which is why I did my PhD on it. All right, so the neural tube, when it starts expanding, you start getting three main regions starting to develop: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Okay? These three regions are going to eventually start differentiating into all the respective regions. The telencephalon and the diencephalon are derived from the forebrain. The telencephalon is what mostly becomes your cerebrum, your main part of your brain. When you think of the brain, this is what people typically think about, the cerebrum, the two large hemispheres of your brain. That is from the telencephalon. Now, this also includes the hippocampus and the olfactory lobes, which is for smelling. But these two folds right here, that forms the two main hemispheres of your brain, the cerebrum. The next part, the diencephalon, these form, amongst other things, primarily your hypothalamus and your thalamus. So if we look at the anatomy, that's right here in this region. The hypothalamus and the thalamus, these play a major role in your endocrine system. They're kind of the connection between your endocrine system and your nervous system, amongst other things. There's a lot of factors that go into the hypothalamus and the thalamus. But that is the other part of the forebrain. So between the two, between the telencephalon and the diencephalon, you get most of the brain. You get the cerebrum, you get the hypothalamus, you get the thalamus. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus primarily come from the diencephalon. And the telencephalon, the two major hemispheres of your brain, that's where the telencephalon comes from. Mesencephalon, that's simple enough. It actually just becomes the midbrain, which doesn't have any other name but midbrain. So your midbrain becomes your midbrain, essentially, this middle region right here. So what do the last parts become? The hindbrain. Sometimes we call this the Robbins Cephalon. And you'll see why. It's because this is where the rhombomeres form. The Robbins Cephalon, or the hindbrain, this becomes two parts called the metencephalon and myelencephalon. Now, a lot of times people they're like, well, how am I going to keep these straight? This is how I keep it straight. Just think of the alphabet. S comes before T, which comes before Y. So STY just gives you the dynamics of middle to behind. Mesencephalon, then metencephalon, then myelencephalon. That's how I remember it in terms of S and then T and then Y as far as the order in which they go. Okay, so what does the metencephalon become? The cerebellum and the pons, which is responsible for your movement, coordination of movements. This is the part of your brain that alcohol affects and all that good stuff. There's your pons. And then your medulla oblongata. So as you can see, these are the major parts of the brain. But in order for this to develop properly, occlusion must occur between the spinal column and the brain, so you get proper expansion of these regions of all organs that we have. I mean, it's just astronomical as far as how many neurons form and how many connections form in these. Now, not all the neurons survive. And it's actually a great number of these will die off. But the number of connections that still remain is astronomical. So this just kind of shows you the same illustration, how the brain will start expanding. If you look at various stages of embryological development, you can see how it starts folding over and you get these various regions. That's the neural tube expanding into the various regions of the brain. And that requires occlusion to cause this expansion, and then you're still getting mitotic events and other things going on here, but that does play a vital role in the formation and the osmotic pressure and things that will create the brain. The spinal column itself doesn't really expand that much except just through mitosis and normal development in that regard. There's not really expansion due to pressure in the spinal column. Okay. Now, the Robbins Cephalon, which is the hindbrain, there are regions in the brain that give rise to various key clusters that are connected to the brain and other parts of the body. For example, you get the trigeminal nerve, which innervates the face and the eyes in these regions. You get the facial and vestibuloacoustic, which is your hearing and things of that sort. You get the glossopharyngeal cranial nerve, which is more in the anterior or the more caudal. So these rhombomeres, we're going to go into these more when we talk about the neural crest cells, but this is in the hindbrain. This is the hindbrain region, which is why we call it the Robbins Cephalon at times. Here's just an illustration showing these rhombomeres. They're discrete regions where neurons start forming and cells start migrating from to form these nerve clusters. If you look at the brain, you can actually see these nerve clusters that will synapse with the brain as well as other regions. Here's just kind of a cartoonish version of these nerve clusters that start forming from the rhombomeres.